A sleepy summary of the 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene. The first law is about never outshining the master. This sounds simple, almost embarrassingly obvious, and yet it is one of the most commonly violated rules in all of human history. The story that Greene returns to again and again to illustrate this law is the story of Nicolas Fouquet, the finance minister to the young King Louis XIV of France. Fouquet was brilliant, wealthy, socially gifted, and this was his fatal error, not quite wise enough. In 1661, he threw a party at his chateau of Vaux-le-Vicomte, and this party was, by any measure, extraordinary. The food, the entertainment, the architecture, the gardens, everything was magnificent, dazzling, breathtaking. And King Louis XIV stood in the middle of all this magnificence and felt something tighten in his chest. He looked around at this palace that was more beautiful than his own, at this display of wealth and taste that exceeded his own, and he understood that Fouquet had, however unintentionally, made him feel small. 3 weeks later, Fouquet was arrested. He spent the rest of his life in prison. The lesson is not that you should be less than you are. The lesson is that you should always make the people above you feel comfortably superior. You can be talented, you can be valuable, you can even be brilliant, but you should arrange things so that your brilliance somehow reflects glory upward onto the person with power over you, rather than casting a shadow down onto them. Make them look good. Let them take credit. Seem a little less capable than you are when the situation calls for it. The ego of the person above you is a delicate and volatile thing. Treat it accordingly. The second law says never put too much trust in friends and learn how to use enemies. This one surprises people. We are raised to believe that friends are precious, that loyalty is the highest virtue, that you should surround yourself with people who love you. And yes, all of that is true in the realm of private life, of genuine human connection. But Greene is writing about the realm of power, and in that realm, friends are often more dangerous than enemies, for a strange and counterintuitive reason. Friends expect things. When you give a job to an enemy, they are grateful and work hard to prove themselves. When you give a job to a friend, they assume that friendship entitles them to shortcuts, to forgiveness, to special treatment. They grow lazy. They grow resentful when you hold them to the same standards you would apply to anyone else. They feel betrayed when the demands of your position require you to make decisions that don't prioritize their comfort. And when a friend turns against you, which happens more often than we like to admit, they make the most vicious of enemies because they know where all the soft spots are. This law also contains a second, stranger piece of wisdom. Keep your enemies close. Not because the saying is simply a cliché, but because enemies serve a function. They keep you sharp. They give you something to push against. And sometimes the best move is to draw an enemy toward you, make them useful, convert their hostility into something that serves your purposes. The Roman emperor who pardoned a would-be assassin and then made the man his ally understood this principle perfectly. The pardoned man, overwhelmed by gratitude and by the strangeness of his situation, became one of the emperor's most devoted supporters. The third law advises concealing your intentions. The magician never explains the trick. The chess player never announces their strategy. The person who wants something should never let the person who has it know quite how much they want it, because the moment you reveal the depth of your desire, the other person gains power over you. They can make you wait. They can make you pay more. They can simply enjoy the feeling of being needed. Greene describes this as a kind of perpetual misdirection, not necessarily lying, but deflecting, obscuring, sending up false trails, keeping people focused on what you appear to want rather than what you actually want. Cardinal Richelieu, the great French statesman, was a master of this. He would smile warmly at a man he intended to destroy, would seem to support a plan he intended to undermine, would appear to move in one direction while actually moving in another. By the time anyone understood what he was actually doing, it was already done. There is something deeply peaceful about this law, actually, if you think about it from the right angle. It is an invitation to become still, to stop broadcasting your anxiety, your desire, your fear, to move more quietly through the world. People who constantly announce what they want are like radios that never turn off, exhausting, easy to tune out, easy to manipulate. People who move in silence, who keep their own counsel, who watch and wait before revealing anything, these people are harder to read, harder to counter, and often more effective. The fourth law says always say less than necessary. A corollary to the third law, this one focuses specifically on words. Words are strange things. We produce them constantly, reflexively, as if silence were a kind of emergency to be filled. But every word you speak is information given away. Every explanation is a potential weakness revealed. Every nervous elaboration is a signal of insecurity. The person who speaks little in almost every social context appears more powerful, more mysterious, more in control than the person who rambles. Think of the authority figures you've encountered who said very little but whose silence felt heavy and significant. Think of the ones who talked too much, who over-explained their decisions, who filled every pause with justifications. Which ones felt more powerful? The law counsels a kind of deliberate spareness. Say what needs to be said, then stop. Let silence do the rest. Let the other person fill the void, because they will, they almost always will, and in filling it they will often reveal far more than you ever asked for. Louis XIV was famous for responding to almost anything with a long, calm stare. Diplomats would come to him with elaborate proposals, full of careful arguments and strategic justifications, and he would just look at them. The silence was unbearable. They would start talking again, saying things they hadn't intended to say, making concessions they hadn't planned to make. And Louis XIV would say nothing. The fifth law asks you to guard your reputation with your life. In the old courts, your reputation was everything. It was the infrastructure upon which all your other plans depended. A good reputation meant that people gave you the benefit of the doubt, opened doors for you, extended credit and trust. A ruined reputation meant that every action you took was interpreted in the worst possible light, that every door was quietly shut before you reached it, that all your cleverness and talent and ambition operated as if in a vacuum, pushing against nothing. Greene writes about the Chinese statesman who knew that a rival was spreading rumors about him. Rather than defending himself directly, which would have only amplified the rumors and made them seem more substantial, he found another way to demonstrate his character through a series of visible, undeniable acts of integrity that made the rumors seem obviously false to anyone paying attention. He never mentioned the rumors. He simply made them unbelievable. The point is that your reputation is an asset that requires constant management, not through vanity or obsessive image control, but through the slow, consistent accumulation of actions that speak for themselves. And when someone attacks your reputation, as someone inevitably will, the response matters enormously. Panic is contagious and makes you look guilty. Calm, deliberate counteraction, preferably focused on undermining the reputation of the attacker rather than defending yourself directly, is almost always more effective. The sixth law is about court attention at all costs. This sounds crass until you understand what Greene means by it. He doesn't mean be obnoxious or desperate. He means that in any competitive environment, invisibility is fatal. The person who is not thought about is not chosen, not promoted, not remembered when the good opportunities arise. You must find ways to make yourself consistently present in the minds of the people who matter to your ambitions. The most interesting version of this law involves what Greene calls the bad reputation gambit, the observation that being talked about negatively is still better than not being talked about at all. The court was fascinated by the rake, the eccentric, the scandalous figure, precisely because these people refused to be boring. A reputation for mystery, for unpredictability, for having done something outrageous in the past, can follow a person like a useful shadow, keeping them interesting long after the original incident has faded. Sarah Bernhardt, the great 19th-century actress, understood this instinctively. She slept in a coffin. She kept a pet lion. She said outrageous things to journalists and then did things even more outrageous than what she said. Every single one of these actions was calculated to keep her name in circulation, to ensure that even people who had never seen her perform had feelings about her, had opinions, had curiosity. And curiosity sells tickets. The seventh law tells us to get others to do the work for you, but always take the credit. This sounds morally uncomfortable, and it is, until you look at it carefully enough to see that it's also just a description of how large organizations actually function. The general does not fight the battle. The CEO does not write the code. The conductor does not play every instrument. The person at the top absorbs credit that is generated by many people below them, and this is understood by everyone in the organization, and is in fact the arrangement that everyone has agreed to. The more interesting application of this law involves intellectual and creative work. Greene describes scientists who are skilled at arriving at precisely the moment when someone else's long labor was about to bear fruit, and attaching themselves to the project just in time to share the discovery. He describes businessmen who identified talented individuals, brought them into their orbits, gave them resources and infrastructure, and then collected a disproportionate share of whatever those individuals produced. This is not described approvingly. Greene is a morally complex writer, and he often presents these laws with a kind of cool neutrality that implies he sees the dark side, but it is described accurately. This is something that happens. The counter-law, the wisdom embedded in the uncomfortable truth, is this: if you are someone who does the work, you must also be someone who takes steps to ensure your work is seen and associated with your name. Never assume that quality speaks for itself. It doesn't reliably in organizations. You have to do a little work to make sure the right people know who made the thing that impressed them. The eighth law asks you to make other people come to you. Use bait if necessary. The principle here is about controlling the terrain of any encounter. When you go to someone else, you enter their space, follow their schedule, sit in their chair, drink their coffee, or don't drink their coffee, all on their terms. You are already slightly off balance, slightly subordinate, before a word has been exchanged. But when you can induce them to come to you, when you can make yourself interesting enough, valuable enough, hard enough to reach that they make the effort, you have already won a subtle but significant advantage. Napoleon understood this. He was famous for keeping people waiting, for making delegations and ambassadors cool their heels for hours before granting an audience. Every minute of waiting reminded them of the asymmetry between his position and theirs. By the time they actually sat across from him, they were already slightly desperate to please. Bait in this context means anything that draws people toward you: reputation, mystery, the promise of something valuable, the scarcity of your attention. If everyone can reach you at any moment, your attention is worth very little. If you are genuinely difficult to reach, your attention becomes precious. It's a simple principle of scarcity and value applied to the currency of presence and time. The ninth law says win through your actions, never through argument. This one is particularly soothing to contemplate because it is essentially an argument against arguing, and most of us, deep down, know that arguments are exhausting and rarely achieve what we hope they will. Greene observes that when you win an argument, you have demonstrated your superior logic, your better preparation, your sharper mind. And in doing so, you have also made your opponent feel stupid and humiliated. The person who loses an argument does not think, "How wonderful, I have now been corrected and will update my views accordingly." They think, "I hate this person." They begin looking for ways to undermine the winner, to find evidence that they were wrong, to win next time. Argument, even when successful, creates enemies. But demonstrate your point through action. Let reality make the argument for you, and no one can push back in the same way. When the proof is undeniable and visible and sitting right there in front of everyone, there is nothing to argue about. The person who was wrong simply absorbs the lesson in silence, without the added indignity of having been publicly corrected by someone who seemed to enjoy it. This law counsels patience. Wait until you can show rather than tell. Do rather than debate. Let the results speak. And in the meantime, smile pleasantly and say nothing that could be construed as an argument. The 10th law, infection, avoid the unhappy and the unlucky. This is one of the harder laws to absorb without a certain uncomfortable recognition. We have all known people whose misery seemed contagious, who moved through the world trailing clouds of bad luck and dysfunction, who managed to make everyone around them feel heavier and more anxious and less capable. And we have all, if we are honest, sometimes been that person. Greene's observation is a blunt one. Misery and bad luck are, in some meaningful sense, patterned behaviors and worldviews that propagate themselves through contact. The chronically unlucky person often has a set of habits, beliefs, and tendencies that reliably produce bad outcomes, and spending a great deal of time with such a person means being slowly schooled in those habits and tendencies. You begin to see the world through their eyes, which is a world full of enemies and obstacles and betrayals, and you begin to attract the same difficulties they attract. This is not to say abandon all people who are struggling. It is to say, be selective, be aware of energy, be conscious of who makes you feel expanded and capable, and who makes you feel contracted and small, and arrange your life accordingly when you can. Seek out the happy, the energetic, the fortunate. Happiness is also contagious. The 11th law says learn to keep people dependent on you. The colder formulation of an essentially practical truth. Security and value come from being necessary. The blacksmith in the medieval village could never be exiled from the town, no matter what personal enemies he made, because everyone needed their swords sharpened and their horseshoes fitted. The doctor in the closed community is protected by their indispensability. The person who holds specialized knowledge that only they possess, who has cultivated a skill or a relationship or an access point that no one else has, is in a fundamentally secure position. Greene tells the story of the court painter who kept certain techniques secret from his students, not entirely, not so much that they couldn't function as artists, but just enough that their work always had some quality that only he could fully explain and impart. Students who mastered all his techniques were sent away, their education declared complete, their usefulness as students exhausted. But those who were still learning, still dependent, were kept close and were employed and protected. This is also a story about the danger of teaching everything you know to a successor too quickly. The mentor who becomes completely transparent and fully educates their replacement has made themselves redundant. Share what you know generously, but retain the expertise that makes you essential. The 12th law, use selective honesty and generosity to disarm your victim, is one of the more elegantly counterintuitive laws in the book. The idea is this: in a world where everyone is assumed to be pursuing their own advantage, a sudden and sincere act of generosity or honesty disarms people completely. It seems so out of place, so surprising, that it bypasses all the usual defenses. The con artist's most powerful tool is a convincing performance of absolute sincerity. The moment you decide, against all your instincts, to trust someone, you lower your guard, and everything else follows from that. A single generous act, carefully placed, can purchase an enormous amount of goodwill that can then be drawn upon for a very long time. The strategic implication is not that you should be dishonest in general, but that you should understand the power of genuine seeming generosity at key moments. The gift given at exactly the right time, when someone most needs it, when they least expect it, when it comes with no visible strings attached. That gift creates a debt that is never quite consciously acknowledged, but is always felt. The 13th law says when asking for help, appeal to people's self-interest, never to their mercy or gratitude. This law cuts straight through a very common misunderstanding about human motivation. We tend to frame requests in terms of our own need, how much we need the help, how much we would appreciate it, how grateful we've been in the past. And people listen to all of this with half an ear and a certain impatience, because what they're actually asking themselves is, what's in it for me? The skilled petitioner presents the help they need as something that serves the helper. They frame their request as an opportunity for the other person, a chance for the helper to gain something, whether that something is money, influence, information, alliance, or simply the very pleasant feeling of being generous and capable. The moment the other person can see how helping you helps them, the request becomes easy to say yes to. This sounds obvious. Almost everyone knows in the abstract that this is how persuasion works. And yet almost everyone, when they actually need something, defaults to an appeal to relationship, to history, to kindness, because it feels more honest, more vulnerable, more human. And it is more human. It's just usually less effective. The 14th law: pose as a friend, work as a spy. Another cold one. The information you can gather in relaxed, friendly conversation far exceeds what you can learn through formal inquiry or research. When people are comfortable, when their guard is down, when they feel seen and liked and valued, they talk. They tell you things they wouldn't tell an interviewer. They reveal their fears, their ambitions, their vulnerabilities, their plans. The spy in this context isn't necessarily sinister. It might be as simple as a very attentive listener who asks good questions and remembers everything. The point is to understand that social interaction is also information exchange, and that the person who moves through the world wide-eyed and attentive, who asks one more question when everyone else would have moved on, who notices the small tell at the edge of the smile, gradually accumulates a rich picture of the people around them that yields significant strategic advantages. Greene also notes the value of using third parties as information gatherers, introducing people to someone else, and then listening to what they tell that person, which may be quite different from what they tell you. The 15th law says crush your enemy totally. This is one of the laws that Greene presents with full awareness of its brutality, and it's worth understanding the logic before being horrified by the instruction. The reasoning goes like this: a partially defeated enemy is a future enemy. Someone who has been reduced, humiliated, lost their position, but not completely, not finally, has every reason to spend all their remaining energy on revenge. They have nothing to lose. They are freed from the normal constraints of social calculation by the fact that they're already down, and their knowledge of you, accumulated over the course of your conflict, makes them a particularly dangerous enemy. History is full of rulers who showed mercy to defeated rivals and were undone by those rivals in their next incarnation. Caesar spared Brutus. The point does not require elaboration. The law is not universally applicable. It is a counsel for situations of genuine strategic conflict, not for ordinary social friction. And Greene is careful to note that crushing can take many forms, not all of them physical. Destroying someone's ability to continue the conflict, removing their resources and allies and platforms, making their future attacks structurally impossible. These are all forms of the principle. The 16th law is about using absence to increase respect and honor. This is the supply and demand principle applied to presence. Everything becomes more precious when it is scarce. The person who is always available, always there, always accessible, gradually becomes furniture, present, useful, but essentially invisible. The person who disappears occasionally, who becomes hard to reach, who travels, who withdraws, returns to find that in their absence they have been discussed, wondered about, missed. This law works most powerfully in matters of love and affection, where the beloved who is too consistently available can somehow drain the desire out of a relationship through sheer accessibility. But it works in professional contexts too. The consultant who comes in, delivers tremendous value, and then is gone, who must be hired again for the next project rather than being permanently embedded, is often perceived as more valuable than the full-time employee doing comparable work. Scarcity and mystery are almost always enhancing. Ubiquity is almost always diminishing. The 17th law, keep others in suspended terror, cultivate an air of unpredictability. This law is about the strategic value of being difficult to read. When people can accurately predict your behavior, they can prepare for it, work around it, neutralize it. When they cannot predict what you'll do next, they spend enormous energy trying to figure it out, and that energy is no longer being spent on opposing you. Bobby Fischer, the chess genius, was a master of this principle applied off the board as well as on it. His demands were outrageous and seemingly random. He required specific types of chairs, specific lighting conditions, protested about the noise of cameras. Some of this was genuine neurosis, but the effect, deliberate or not, was to throw his opponents into confusion and uncertainty before the game even started. They were so focused on trying to understand what he would demand next, so unsettled by the unpredictability of his behavior, that they arrived at the board already off balance. Unpredictability, used strategically, is a form of control. The 18th law, do not build fortresses to protect yourself. Isolation is dangerous. This law seems to contradict several earlier laws about withdrawal and scarcity, but it operates on a different level. There is a difference between strategic absence, disappearing intentionally to increase your value, and isolating yourself out of fear, cutting yourself off from information and contact, and the social circulation that keeps you relevant and informed. The ruler who retreats behind walls, who trusts only a tiny inner circle, who becomes paranoid and inaccessible, is actually making himself more vulnerable, not less. He has no information. He doesn't know what's happening outside. The tiny inner circle, precisely because it is the only channel to power, becomes enormously powerful itself, and the members of that circle know it and begin to use that power for their own purposes. The isolated ruler is manipulated by the very people he imagined were his protection. Stay in circulation. Keep many channels of information open. Trust no single source completely. Move through the world enough to see it clearly. The 19th law, know who you're dealing with, do not offend the wrong person. Not everyone responds to the same approach. Not everyone, when insulted or outmaneuvered, accepts the loss and moves on. Some people are vain and sensitive and will nurse a grudge for years. Some people are connected in ways that aren't visible on the surface. Some people, apparently small and harmless, have unexpected resources of retribution. Before making an enemy of someone, or before deciding that you can safely ignore their feelings, take a moment to understand who they actually are, not just who they appear to be. The most dangerous person in the room is often not the loudest or the most obviously powerful. It might be the quiet one in the corner who has been watching everything. The 20th law, do not commit to anyone. This is the law of the master diplomat, the power broker, the person who everyone wants on their side, and who maintains that value by never definitively getting on anyone's side. Once you commit to a faction, to a leader, to a cause, you are defined by that commitment and limited by it. Your options narrow, your freedom to maneuver decreases, and if the person or cause you've committed to falls, you fall with them. The uncommitted person, the one who listens carefully to all sides, who seems sympathetic to everyone, who never quite declares themselves, this person is courted by all factions. They are valuable precisely because their allegiance is still in play. Commitment ends the bidding war. This law is, of course, in tension with a certain kind of integrity. It is possible to follow this law in a way that is merely craven, to be strategically non-committal not out of wisdom, but out of cowardice. Greene acknowledges the tension. The ideal is to commit when commitment is strategically sound and the cause is genuinely worthy, but never to commit reflexively out of emotional pressure or social expectation without having thought through the implications. Your thoughts are getting softer now, less sharp. Good. The 21st law, play a sucker to catch a sucker, seem dumber than your mark. Intelligence, openly displayed, threatens people. The person who is obviously smarter than everyone else in the room makes everyone else defensive and self-conscious. The person who seems a little slow, a little confused, a little in need of explanation, makes everyone else feel generous and superior and safe. And from that position of apparent helplessness, you can gather a great deal of information while giving very little away. Socrates used a version of this called irony, pretending ignorance, asking innocent questions, and then guiding the conversation step by step to a conclusion that his interlocutor would never have agreed to directly. The questions seemed harmless. The confessor felt smart for explaining. And then, halfway down the path, he'd realize he'd been led somewhere he didn't intend to go, and he couldn't quite find his way back. The 22nd law, use the surrender tactic, transform weakness into power. When you are genuinely outmatched, fighting is usually the worst strategy. It damages you further, depletes your resources, hardens your opponent's position. The smarter move is to yield gracefully, strategically, in a way that costs you the minimum and preserves the maximum. But surrender in this context is not defeat. It is a tactic. You retreat to a position from which you can rebuild. You buy time. You allow the more powerful person to feel that they have won, which softens their vigilance. And while they are enjoying their victory, you are quietly reconstituting yourself. Greene uses the example of the Aikido principle. The master of this martial art doesn't meet force with force. They redirect it. They use the attacker's momentum against them. The apparent submission is actually a form of control. The 23rd law, concentrate your forces. This is a law about focus. In any competitive endeavor, the person who divides their attention and resources across many fronts weakens each front. The person who concentrates, who identifies the single most important lever, the single most valuable relationship, the single most consequential skill, and devotes everything to that concentration, achieves disproportionate results. The great military commanders understood this intuitively. Napoleon's strategy was almost always about concentration of force at a single decisive point, finding the weakness in the enemy line, massing his strength there, breaking through before the opponent could respond. This same principle, applied to resources in business or social influence in courts, is equally powerful. Do not spread yourself thin. Find the vein of gold and dig. The 24th law, play the perfect courtier. The ideal courtier, as described in Baldassare Castiglioni's famous Renaissance text, was a kind of social masterpiece, brilliant without being threatening, charming without being sycophantic, opinionated without being combative, bold in action but graceful in manner. Everything they did appeared effortless. Their competence was evident but never showy. Their presence was felt but never overwhelming. This is a description of a very particular kind of social intelligence, the ability to read a room perfectly, to modulate your presentation to the exact requirements of the moment, to be all things to all people without appearing to be anything other than entirely, authentically yourself. It is a high art. It requires years of observation and practice. But the person who masters it is almost impossible to dislike and very difficult to dismiss. The 25th law, recreate yourself. This is one of the most liberating laws in the book, and it comes with a kind of existential permission that feels almost tender after some of the colder strategic counsel. The law says you are not fixed. The identity you were given by your family, your class, your culture, your early experiences, it is a costume, not a cage. You can take it off. You can design a new one. The great actors and performers and visionaries have always understood this. Coco Chanel invented a version of herself that had almost nothing to do with her actual origins. David Bowie created and discarded identities like seasons, always arriving in a new form before the world had finished reacting to the last one. Napoleon consciously shaped his own mythology, understanding that how he was perceived was as important as what he actually did. The law is an invitation to authorship. You are writing a character, the character of yourself in the world. Make it intentional, make it interesting. The 26th law, keep your hands clean. The powerful person almost never appears to be the cause of the bad things that happen. They remain at a comfortable remove from the dirty work, which is done by subordinates, by intermediaries, by people who can be blamed, if necessary, and discarded. The king does not sign the execution order in his own hand, if he can help it. The CEO is not in the room when the shady deal is made. This is partly about deniability and partly about something deeper, the psychological and social necessity of appearing clean, of being the person everyone wants to believe in. Even people who know rationally that their leader has done terrible things often need to believe, need to perform the fiction of believing that the leader's hands are clean because the alternative is too destabilizing. The clean hand is not necessarily an innocent hand. It is a strategically protected hand. The 27th law, play on people's need to believe to create a cult-like following. Human beings have a deep, almost constitutional need to believe in something, in a leader, a system, a vision, a truth that organizes the chaos of experience into something meaningful. The person who can offer that, who can present themselves as the bearer of a transformative vision, who speaks in the language of faith and destiny and special knowledge, can attract a devoted following that does an enormous amount of work and asks very little in return. The charismatic leaders in history who built movements around themselves understood that they were not just offering policy or strategy, they were offering meaning. And meaning is the thing that people want most desperately and find most difficult to manufacture for themselves. The shadow side of this law is obvious. The cult leader who exploits this need is one of history's recurring nightmares. But the principle itself, that people need to believe that they will work tirelessly for something they have faith in, is a morally neutral observation about human psychology. The 28th law, enter action with boldness. Timidity invites aggression. The person who approaches any situation with visible hesitation, who qualifies every step and apologizes for every action, telegraphs their own uncertainty and makes others feel licensed to push them around. The person who enters boldly, who moves as if the space were already theirs, who speaks as if their right to speak were beyond question, finds that the world, remarkably often, goes along with the performance. This is not a counsel to recklessness. Bold action informed by careful preparation is different from bold action informed by nothing but bravado. But once the preparation is done, once the decision is made, move. Move decisively. Move as if you cannot conceive of failure. The lion that chases its prey uncertainly catches nothing. The 29th law, plan all the way to the end. This is a law about the failure of imagination that afflicts most plans. We think carefully about the opening moves and then trust to improvisation and luck for the middle and the end. But the middle and the end are where most plans collapse, undone by contingencies that were, in principle, foreseeable. The chess player who thinks only 3 moves ahead is eventually beaten by the one who thinks 10. The general who plans only the first battle is surprised by the second. The person who thinks through all the possible ways their plan could fail, who prepares responses to each failure mode, who has an exit strategy as well as an entrance strategy, survives the inevitable complications. The ancients sometimes performed elaborate divination rituals before undertaking important actions, and one function of these rituals, quite apart from any supernatural dimension, was to force a long, careful contemplation of all the things that might go wrong. It was institutionalized anxiety in the service of preparation. The 30th law, make your accomplishments seem effortless. Nothing is more impressive than the appearance of ease, the dancer who seems to barely try. The musician whose fingers move as if the music is simply flowing through them. The writer whose sentences read as if they were simply found already perfect. The effort that produced these things, the years of practice, the thousands of failed attempts, the grinding repetition, is invisible and must be invisible because effort is in some ways the enemy of grace. There is also a strategic element here. When you reveal the effort behind your accomplishments, you give away your methods. You provide a map for people who want to compete with you. When your accomplishments seem effortless, they seem mysterious, and mystery is a form of power. Hold back the curtain. Let the magic be magic. The 31st law, control the options, get others to play with the cards you deal. Real choice is rare. What appears to be choice is often a selection among options that have been curated by someone else, someone who benefits no matter which option is chosen. The magician who asks you to pick a card from a fan deck may have arranged the deck so that you inevitably choose the card they want you to choose. You feel free. You made a choice. You have no idea that the choice was made for you. This is not always sinister. Every menu in every restaurant is a curation of options. Every election, to some extent, offers choices that were shaped by forces that never appear on the ballot. The point of this law is awareness, to see the shape of the options you're being offered and to ask who benefits from each of them before choosing. The 32nd law: play to people's fantasies. Reality is hard and complicated and full of disappointments. Fantasy is smooth and satisfying and offers exactly what we most want. The person who can speak to the fantasy, who can paint a vivid picture of how good things could be, who can offer an alternative to the difficult present, will always have an audience. The great salesman, the great political leader, the great religious figure, they are all, in some essential way, purveyors of beautiful alternatives to the present moment. Whether those alternatives are achievable is, in the short term, almost beside the point. The power of the fantasy, the emotional lift it provides, the feeling of hope and possibility and specialness it generates, this is the product. This is what is being sold. The 33rd law: discover each man's thumbscrew. Everyone has something: a fear, a desire, an insecurity, a dream, a point of pride that makes them particularly susceptible to a particular kind of influence. The person who has a desperate need for approval can be controlled through praise and its withdrawal. The person who fears humiliation above all things can be steered by the threat of exposure. The person who secretly believes they are the most important person in the room will do almost anything for someone who confirms that belief. This law requires patient observation and a real interest in other people, not in what they present to the world, but in what they protect, what they avoid, where they flinch. It requires the kind of careful, unhurried attention that most people are too distracted and too self-absorbed to bring. The 34th law: be royal in your own fashion, act like a king to be treated like one. Dignity is, to a remarkable extent, self-declared. The person who carries themselves as if they deserve respect tends to receive it, at least initially, because people take their cues from your own presentation of yourself. The person who appears to expect to be dismissed is usually dismissed. This is not about arrogance. Arrogance is insecure, it overcompensates, it protests too much. True dignity is quiet and unruffled. It doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need to be defended. It simply proceeds as if the question of whether it deserves respect has been settled once and for all by itself in private and is not open for further discussion. The 35th law: master the art of timing. Everything in the right moment. The seed planted in the wrong season doesn't grow. The word spoken at the wrong moment, even the right word, falls into silence or hostility. The person of power feels the rhythms of the moment, senses when conditions are ripe for action and when they require patience, and acts accordingly. Timing is partly observation and partly self-discipline. The self-discipline to wait, even when everything in you is urging action, when the moment isn't quite right, is often the hardest part of power. The 36th law: disdain things you cannot have, ignoring them is the best revenge. When you cannot have something, Reaching for it only reinforces its power over you. Making it clear that you want it and can't have it is an advertisement of weakness. The countermove is elegant. Simply act as if the thing doesn't matter, isn't worth having, is beneath your notice. This is partly performed, but it can also become genuine. When you consistently behave as if something doesn't matter to you, your psyche often catches up with the performance. The thing really does begin to matter less. The person who wounded you really does begin to seem smaller and more pathetic and less worth your energy. Contempt, even when it begins as a strategic posture, has a way of becoming a kind of liberation. The 37th law: create compelling spectacles. The eye is the most direct route to the emotions and the imagination. Words require processing, interpretation, the slow machinery of reason. But a striking image, a beautiful and dramatic scene, a spectacle that overwhelms the senses. This bypasses all of that and lands directly in the emotional core. Every great public ceremony, every religious ritual, every political rally, every coronation, every state funeral, every parade, these are theaters of power, designed to produce in the observer a felt sense of the significance of what is happening that no amount of explanation could achieve. The person who understands spectacle, who understands how to stage the moments that matter, who understands the power of the visual and the theatrical, this person communicates at a frequency that goes directly to the gut. The 38th law: think as you like, but behave like others. Nonconformity is costly. The person who expresses their unconventional views freely and consistently will attract a great deal of opposition, and most of that opposition will not take the form of interesting debate. It will take the form of exclusion, suspicion, and behind-the-scenes sabotage. People are uncomfortable with those who seem to reject the values and norms they have organized their lives around. The wise strategy is to maintain the unconventional view privately, to share it only with people you trust completely, and to appear in public, in professional contexts, in the broad social world, to be a perfectly conventional, agreeable, unremarkable member of the community. This is not hypocrisy in the pejorative sense. It is prudence. It is the understanding that social norms are a kind of territory that must be navigated carefully, and that the reward for navigating them well is the freedom to think whatever you like in the privacy of your own mind. The 39th law: stir up waters to catch fish. Agitation, confusion, emotional turbulence, in others, not in yourself, can be strategic tools. The person who remains calm while everyone around them is panicking has an enormous advantage. The person who can introduce a destabilizing element into a situation and then watch how people respond, gathering information while others lose their composure, is in a position of considerable power. The provocateur is often disliked, but is rarely ignored, and being noticed is in many situations more valuable than being liked. The 40th law: despise the free lunch. Things that cost nothing are paradoxically often perceived as worthless. The gift freely given creates no obligation, no sense of value, no commitment. The price of something, even an arbitrary, artificial price, establishes that it has worth. The patient who pays a lot for therapy takes it more seriously than the patient who receives it for free, regardless of the actual quality of the treatment. This law is also about the traps concealed in apparent generosity. When someone offers you something for nothing, the instinctive reaction should be a question. What is actually being asked? Nothing is truly free. The person who always picks up the check is buying something. The mentor who gives their time endlessly and asks nothing is establishing a debt that will be called in ways you didn't anticipate. The 41st law: avoid stepping into a great man's shoes. The successor faces a peculiar and almost inescapable trap. The predecessor, the founder, the legend, the great person whose shoes you are filling, casts a shadow that makes everything you do seem smaller by comparison. If you try to do what they did, you will seem like an imitation. If you try to do something different, you will be criticized for abandoning what made them great. The only way out is to go around the trap entirely. Establish your own identity so forcefully, so early, so clearly, that the comparison becomes irrelevant. Don't be the successor to the legend. Be the beginning of something new that makes the comparison look backwards. The 42nd law: strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. In any group, there is usually one person, not necessarily the official leader, but the person with the actual social authority, who holds the group together, who shapes its mood, who determines its direction. Remove that person or neutralize them, and the group becomes confused and directionless. The law counsels finding the real centers of influence in any organization or social group. They are not always the obvious ones, and addressing those centers directly, rather than struggling against the whole diffuse mass of collective behavior. The 43rd law: work on the hearts and minds of others. Hard power, force, threats, coercion works in the short term, but is expensive and creates resentment that accumulates interest. Soft power, the kind that wins people over, that creates genuine enthusiasm and loyalty, that makes people feel that they want what you want, is vastly more efficient and durable. The person who can make others believe that their interests are aligned with yours, that following you is in their own best interest, can mobilize energy that no amount of coercion could produce. This is the difference between the tyrant, who is always one revolt away from disaster, and the beloved leader, who can call on the genuine devotion of people who would fight and sacrifice out of something that feels, to them, like choice. The 44th law: disarm and infuriate with the mirror effect. The mirror, reflecting back to someone exactly what they're doing, responding to their tactics with their own tactics, giving them a taste of their own medicine, is one of the most psychologically effective weapons in the arsenal. It is unnerving in a way that direct opposition is not, because it holds up an image that the person cannot quite argue with. The mimicry version of this law is perhaps gentler. Mirror someone's body language, their speech rhythms, their manner, and you create in them a subtle feeling of recognition and affinity, a sense that you are somehow like them, that you understand them, that they can trust you. The 45th law: preach the need for change, but never reform too much at once. Change is frightening. Even change that is obviously beneficial, obviously necessary, obviously overdue, is frightening, because it requires people to abandon the familiar, to relearn habits they have spent years building, to confront the anxiety of the unknown. The radical reformer who tries to change everything at once, who sweeps away the old structures and replaces them with entirely new ones, creates an enormous amount of resistance, not because people are attached to the specific old things, but because they are attached to the stability those old things represented. The wise reformer changes the substance while preserving the forms. The new policy is presented as a natural extension of the old tradition. The revolutionary idea is introduced as a return to original principles. The change happens, but it wears the costume of continuity, and people feel safe enough to accept it. The 46th law: never appear too perfect. Perfection is threatening. The person who seems to have no flaws, no weaknesses, no failures, no visible areas of struggle, makes everyone around them feel inadequate. And people who feel inadequate in your presence do not become your admirers, they become your enemies. The strategic small flaw, the endearing imperfection, the visible struggle that you've overcome, the area where you seem touchingly, humanly less than perfect, makes people comfortable. It gives them a place to stand beside you. It makes you approachable. It also makes the real extent of your abilities less threatening because it's been framed in a context of limitation. Julius Caesar was famous for sharing his epilepsy, his physical vulnerability, as part of his public identity, not concealing it, but allowing it to be known because it made him human, and humans were something Roman soldiers could follow into battle in a way they couldn't follow a god. The 47th law: do not go past the mark you aimed for in victory, learn when to stop. Success generates its own dangers. The person who achieves what they set out to achieve is suddenly in the grip of a particular and seductive kind of madness. The belief that the momentum of success will carry them further, that the conditions that produced the victory will persist indefinitely, that more effort will produce more gain in the same proportion. This is almost never true. History is full of generals who won brilliant victories and then, drunk on success, pushed one battle too far. Napoleon in Russia. Hitler in Russia, for that matter. The campaigns that ended empires were often not the first battles, which were masterpieces, but the last battles, which were hubris. The same pattern repeats in business, in politics, in personal life. The person who can stop, who can bank the win, accept the gain, and resist the pull of more is the rarest and most effective kind of power player. Know when to stop. The hardest discipline and the most important. And the 48th and final law: assume formlessness. This is the deepest and most philosophical of all the laws, and it circles back to something that runs beneath all the others. The most powerful position is one that cannot be attacked, because it cannot be precisely located. Water, in the Taoist tradition, defeats stone not by opposing it, but by flowing around it, finding every opening, taking the shape of whatever contains it. The martial arts master who telegraphs their next move is easier to defeat than the one who moves from pure, responsive spontaneity. Fixed forms are targets. The person who is always the same, who always occupies the same role, who has a predictable response to every situation, can be anticipated, can be outmaneuvered, can be frozen in place. The person who can change form, who can be hard when softness won't work, soft when hardness is counterproductive, who can seem one thing in one context and something entirely different in another, is almost impossible to hold or to defeat. This is not advice to be without principles. It is advice to be without rigidity, to hold your principles lightly enough that they don't become a prison. To be, as much as possible, a living response to a living world rather than a fixed position in a landscape that is always changing. And so we have arrived at the end of the 48 laws. 48 maps of a territory that is as old as human civilization, the territory of power, of influence, of the endlessly complex negotiation between people who want things and people who have them, between those who give and those who take, between the strategic mind and the trusting heart. Greene wrote this book not as a manual for cruelty, though it is sometimes read that way. He wrote it more as a mirror, a long, unsentimental look at how power actually works, stripped of the comforting fictions we prefer. Most people encountering this mirror feel some mixture of recognition and discomfort. Yes, I have seen these patterns. Yes, I have been the sucker in some of these stories. Yes, I have watched these games played around me without quite understanding the rules. The value of knowing the rules is not necessarily to play the game more aggressively. It might be to play it more consciously, to see when it's being played on you, to decide, having understood what is being asked, whether you want to participate. Power, in the end, is not an end in itself. It is a means to whatever ends you have chosen, and the person who knows how it works is always in a better position to direct it toward something worth directing it toward. For now, there is nothing to scheme about, and nothing to protect, and nothing to acquire, and nothing to fear. There is just the weight of sleep descending, slow and warm and total, like water rising in a still room, covering everything, covering the courts and the kings and the clever people with their clever plans, covering all of it gently until there is nothing left but the soft and absolute dark. In the end, this sleepy summary, with its relaxing tone and warm light, is not meant to replace something. It is meant to point toward a much larger light. It is offered with care and with the genuine hope that something in tonight's listening finds its way into you as an invitation. The whole book is waiting. The real depth lives there, in every word they chose and every story they told and every quiet idea they let breathe across a full page. Let this be the beginning of something you carry forward in the light of an ordinary tomorrow, and if this lamp has helped you in some way, a light keeps it burning for someone else who might need it too. Sleep well.